In 1875, the Army shipped a ration crate to Fort Concho, Texas. Inside, 12 pounds of salt pork, 18 pounds of hardtack, dried beans, green coffee nobody had roasted yet. That crate was a week's ration for one Buffalo soldier on patrol. The soldier was Sergeant George Jordan, 9th Cavalry, born into bondage in Williamson County, Tennessee. Every dish on this list passed through Jordan's mess kit in 23 years of service. Number 7 was cooked on a plains fire the night the wind would not quit. Number 13 was rationed at 3/4 of a pound a day. Number 19 came from the battle at Tularosa. These 25 foods were not menu items. They were the line between alive and not. Subscribe so you do not miss the next history kitchen we open. Here are the 25 foods Buffalo soldiers actually ate on the Western frontier. Number 1, hardtack, a flour and water biscuit, baked twice, hard as a roof shingle. The Army called it bread. The soldiers called it angle cake or worm castles. Each man got about 16 ounces a day on campaign. You softened it in coffee and bacon grease and stew, or you broke it with the butt of your rifle. A Buffalo soldier learned fast that hardtack was not food until you worked on it. It was a problem to be solved. The biscuits stayed edible for years if kept dry, which was the whole point. On a 200-mile patrol out of Fort Davis, your saddlebag hardtack was the one thing you could trust on day 8. The thing is, hardtack outlasted everything in the wagon, even the men who packed it. Frontier troopers, generation after generation of them, ate it dunked and silent. It wasn't delicious. It kept you alive. Back then, that's what mattered more than flavor. Number 2, salt pork. Soldiers called it sow belly. The Army issued 3/4 of a pound a day on campaign, packed in heavy wooden barrels with so much salt the meat could outlast a steamboat journey. You sliced it thin and fried it until the fat ran clear. That fat then cooked everything else. Beans, onions, hardtack, leftover coffee grounds, all of it went into the same skillet. Buffalo soldiers in the 10th Cavalry at Fort Concho in 1875 ate sow belly 6 days out of 7. The meat itself was tough and sharply salted, like a brick of cured leather. The grease was the real prize. That grease seasoned every pot from El Paso to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. A trooper learned to cook from the rendered fat first, the meat second. Now here is the part most people miss. Sow belly was not loved, it was respected. Cavalry cooks treated it like a tool, not a treat, and the men ate it every other day for years on end. They didn't complain, they couldn't afford to. Number 3, Army issued dried beans. Pinto, Navy, or whatever the subsistence department shipped that quarter. A Buffalo soldier received about 1/10 of a pound per day, which sounds small until you stew it for 6 hours and watch a cup of dry beans become 4 cups of supper. The cooks at Fort Davis soaked beans overnight in canteens, then simmered them all day in a single iron pot with salt pork and a halved onion if anyone had one. By 1880, dried beans were the most reliable thing in the mess. They survived heat, weevils, and bad water. They filled a man up and kept him filled. Number 9 on this list grew straight out of this same pot, only with chili and Mexican spice. Beans were the floor of every Western post kitchen. Here's what surprised me reading the regimental cookbooks. The bean pot was passed between cooks like a sacred object, never washed dry, only wiped, so each new pot tasted of the last. That habit is older than the Army itself. Your grandmother in Mississippi worked her stew pot the same way. The continuity is the story. Number 4, green coffee beans. Until 1872, the Army shipped coffee unroasted. Each company received raw beans, and somebody had to lay them in a skillet over the fire and roast them dark before anyone got a single cup. The smell of scorched coffee beans, hung over every cavalry camp from Texas to the Dakotas like a signal flag. After 1872, John Arbuckle began packing pre-roasted coffee in 1-pound paper bags with a glaze to lock in freshness. Buffalo soldiers called it Arbuckles, and a bag became the most traded item in the regiment. You could buy favors with it, you could settle debts with it. A scout swapped 2 pounds of Arbuckles to an Apache scout for fresh antelope meat. Coffee was currency. Coffee was the first warm thing a soldier touched on a winter morning at Fort Robinson. It carried memory in a single cup. Your kin who served started his day this way, too, decades back. Same dark roast, same tin cup, hand to hand. Number 5, Skillet cornbread. The Army issued cornmeal as a substitute when wheat flour ran short. Buffalo soldiers in the 24th Infantry marching through New Mexico in 1879 lived on cornmeal, mush, and skillet cornbread for 9 straight days. The recipe was simple and powerful. 2 cups cornmeal, a pinch of salt, water, a spoon of bacon grease. You poured it into a hot iron skillet, set the lid on, and shoveled coals over the top. 12 minutes later, you had a golden disc that broke into 8 wedges. The cooks learned the timing by smell, not clock. Cornbread on the frontier was not Southern soul food yet. It was just supper. But every black trooper from Tennessee or Mississippi or the Carolinas tasted home in it. The skillet cornbread of the 9th Cavalry was the first link in a chain that would later run through every soul food kitchen in America. Your grandmother made it Sunday after Sunday in iron skillets passed down through generations. The recipe stayed the same. The continuity is unbroken. Number 6, sourdough biscuits. The cooks kept the starter alive in a tin pail for weeks at a time, feeding it flour and water every other day, like raising a quiet pet. On detachment from Fort Stockton, a starter could ride 300 miles in a saddle pannier and still rise come morning. The biscuits came out tall, sour, and beautiful when the camp had real flour. They came out flat and gray when the flour was wormy. A Buffalo soldier knew the difference and ate them either way. Sourdough biscuits showed up on Sundays, on payday, on the rare days a captain wanted morale to lift. A stack of 6 on a tin plate with bacon grease melted into them could make a man forget for a moment that he was 80 miles from the nearest white town and not always welcome there. Now, here's the thing most history books skip. Some cooks kept the same starter alive for years, passed from one regiment to the next when men rotated out. That habit tied the cavalry kitchens together. It was a quiet inheritance. Number 7, son of a bitch stew. Imagine the Texas plains, late September 1881. A detachment of 19 men from the 9th Cavalry has dug in along Carrizo Canyon. The cooking fire is small, low, hidden behind a wagon. Sergeant George Jordan keeps watch on the right flank. The cook butchered a young calf at sundown. Heart, liver, kidneys, sweetbreads, marrow, gut, tongue, brains, and strips of tenderloin all went into one pot with onion, salt, pepper, and water. He stirred it with a green mescal stick for 2 hours. The stew thickened on its own from the marrow. The men ate it hot from tin cups, leaning on their saddles, eyes still on the ridgeline. The cowboys borrowed the recipe and gave it the name. The Buffalo soldiers in West Texas had been making it for years before that. Nothing of the calf was wasted because nothing could be on a 4-day patrol with no resupply. The cook tossed the bones into the fire. The grease soaked into the dirt like a slow signature. Jordan ate his portion in 7 minutes and went back to his post. Back then, that was supper. By dawn, the pot was scrubbed with sand and packed away. 3 days later, that same pot fed them again. The recipe survived. The names of most cooks did not. Decades later, working class kitchens from Texas to Oklahoma still made a version of this stew, passed down hand to hand, and most of those families never knew the dish came down from cavalry fires lit by black soldiers on a hard western night. Number 8, Slumgullion, a loose, watery stew of whatever the cook found that day. Slumgullion was the catch-all word for end-of-week cooking, when the salt pork was almost gone and the beans were down to a handful. You boiled water, threw in the leavings, broke up some hardtack to thicken it, added pepper, and called it dinner. Buffalo soldiers at Fort Bayard, New Mexico, ate Slumgullion every Saturday, the day before the resupply wagon was due. It wasn't a recipe, it was a method. The cook tasted as he worked and added salt by feel. Some weeks, Slumgullion was almost a real stew. Some weeks, it was salty water with bread chunks. Either way, you ate it standing up because your shift started in 20 minutes. That was Saturday at the post. The same instinct that cleared a Friday icebox before the new week's groceries arrived lived in those frontier mess pots. Cooks have done this same thing in different kitchens, under different roofs, by different names. Slumgullion was honest, so were the men who ate it. Number 9, desiccated vegetables. The army called them desiccated. The soldiers called them desecrated. They came in dry, round cakes about 2 inches thick, made of compressed potatoes, cabbage, turnips, carrots, parsnips, beets, tomatoes, onions, peas, beans, lentils, and celery. You broke off a chunk, soaked it in hot water, and watched it expand like a sponge into something that smelled like wet hay and cooked grass. Sergeant Cyrus Boyd of the 15th Iowa wrote that they made him sicker than anything in his life. Buffalo soldiers ate them anyway because the post surgeons kept warning about scurvy. By the late 1880s, fresh vegetables from the company gardens were finally beating out the desiccated cakes, and a healthy trooper learned the difference between food that filled you and food that healed you. They were the same plate, only the better one came from dirt the soldiers turned themselves. Frontier men ate the bad version because the better one had not arrived yet. That mattered. The post surgeons knew, the cooks knew. Eventually, the gardens caught up. Number 10, hunted antelope. On long patrols across West Texas and southern New Mexico, the Army ration alone could not stretch. The cavalry hunted to fill the gap. Antelope were the prize, fast, lean, and plentiful on the high plains in the 1870s. A trooper with a Springfield trapdoor rifle, the standard issue weapon, could drop one at 200 yards if the wind was right. The cook butchered the carcass at the camp and roasted strips over the fire that same night. The rest he salted and dried for jerky. Antelope was leaner than beef and tougher, but it cooked fast and stretched the rations by 3 days. Buffalo soldiers in the 10th Cavalry credited antelope with keeping their detachments alive through the dry runs of 1877, when the supply trains broke down twice in a single summer. Imagine the smell of roast meat over mesquite at dusk, the men leaning on saddles, the horses tied off in a long line. That was the working evening of a frontier cavalry camp. You could close your eyes and still feel it. Number 11, pinto beans and bacon. The Mexican border posts gave the regiments a different bean entirely. Pinto beans, mottled brown, traded across the Rio Grande from Mexican farmers near Eagle Pass and Del Rio. Buffalo soldiers learned the recipe from local women who simmered them for hours with bacon, garlic, dried chilies, and cumin. The pot smelled different from the Army issue version, smokier, deeper. The beans broke down into a thick brown gravy that you sopped up with hand-rolled tortillas. The 10th Cavalry, stationed near Fort Duncan in 1880, ate pinto beans and bacon 4 nights a week. A young trooper from Mississippi tasted his first cumin in that pot. He never went back to plain beans again. The pot bubbled on a wood stove for 6 hours. The kitchen hot, the wind coming through cracked adobe walls. That is how cultures meet, not in a treaty room, but in a shared bean pot. The flavor crossed the river before the people did. Cooks carried it both ways across the border for the rest of the era. Number 12, trail jerky. Strips of beef or antelope salted and dried over a low fire for 2 days until they curled and turned the color of old saddle leather. Each trooper carried a tobacco pouch full on long patrols. Jerky weighed almost nothing, kept for months, and could be chewed in the saddle while you rode. The Buffalo Soldiers learned the deeper version from Apache scouts who served alongside them in Arizona. The Apache pounded their dried meat with rendered fat and dried berries to make pemmican, a denser fuel that carried twice the energy of plain jerky. A few Buffalo Soldiers brought the technique back to camp. The Army never officially adopted it, but a quiet supply of pemmican showed up in 9th Cavalry saddlebags through the 1880s. It was the first time most of those men had eaten food prepared by native hands. It would not be the last. Cross-cultural recipes started exactly this kind of ordinary moment. 2 men sharing a strip of dried meat in the shade of a juniper tree. The world changes one shared meal at a time. Number 13, Garrison beef. Consider the math behind a single ration. The 1877 Army Subsistence Department schedule allotted 3/4 of a pound of salt pork or fresh beef, 18 ounces of bread or 16 ounces of hardtack, 1/10 of a pound of beans, and small amounts of coffee, sugar, salt, and vinegar per soldier per day. On paper, that came to roughly 3,500 units of energy. Twice a week at fixed posts like Fort Davis or Fort Robinson, the company drew fresh beef from the post butcher. Each man got about a pound. The cook stewed it with onions, carrots, and whatever vegetables the company garden produced that week. The stew simmered for 3 hours over the iron stove in the mess kitchen. By 1892, the ration had been formally upgraded to include fresh fish and a wider list of fresh vegetables. The Army Medical Department records from 1885 to 1895 show post-hospital admissions for scurvy dropped by 71% across the western forts as Garrison beef and post-garden produce became reliable. Buffalo Soldiers benefited as much as any white regiment, and their cooks documented their methods in regimental cookbooks that survive in the National Archives in Washington. The published data tells a clear story. The early years of poor rations gave way slowly to better ones. The 9th Cavalry mess at Fort Robinson alone ran 2 beef stew nights a week from 1885 onward, with the post butcher dressing 14 head of cattle a month for a single regiment. The cooks rotated 3 head men in 8-hour shifts to keep the stew on the fire from breakfast to supper. Garrison beef was not the most exciting plate of the week. It was the most life-giving one. Troopers credited it with the strength to ride another summer, another winter, another tour. A pound of fresh beef simmered for 3 hours was the closest a Buffalo Soldier got to Sunday at his grandmother's table while still wearing Army blue. Number 14, dried apples and prunes. The Army shipped both in cloth sacks, and they were the closest thing to dessert a Buffalo Soldier saw on the frontier. You soaked dried apples in warm water for an hour, then stewed them with a bit of sugar and cinnamon if the sutler had any in stock. Prunes the cook served plain, sometimes with a splash of vinegar. The fruit was a quiet authority on health. The post surgeons knew dried fruit pushed back against scurvy when fresh produce ran out. A trooper at Fort Apache in 1882 wrote that the prune ration was the only thing that kept his stomach honest during the dry march from White River. Dried apples on a tin plate at the end of supper were a small kindness in a long week. The cooks gave a double portion to anyone on sick call. A grandmother in Tennessee or Mississippi did the same thing on a winter evening, stewing dried apples for sick children. The recipe was simple. The act was generous. Nothing on the table changed for 100 years. Number 15, Mexican chili, Colorado. The 10th Cavalry along the Rio Grande borrowed this dish from the local rancho cooks. A red chili stew, slow simmered with chunks of beef, dried New Mexico chilies, garlic, oregano, and salt. No tomatoes, no beans inside, just meat and chili. The cooks toasted the dried chilies on a comal first, then ground them by hand in a stone molcajete. The pot turned a deep brick red, the color of a good barn at sundown. A buffalo soldier ate his bowl with a stack of tortillas and a tin cup of hot coffee. The 25th Infantry stationed near Fort Bliss ate chili Colorado on Saturdays through the 1880s. The recipe traveled north with the regiments when they later moved to Montana. A version of it ended up in black church kitchens in Kansas City by 1910, brought home by veterans who never forgot the smell of toasting chilies on a cold border night. That was the route most American food took. Nobody wrote it down. Cooks carried it home anyway. The pot was the textbook. Number 16, hand-rolled tortillas. Mexican women who ran washing and laundry near the border posts also made tortillas by the dozen and traded them for soap, coffee, and small coins. A stack of 6 warm corn tortillas cost about 2 cents in 1880. The dough, masa, was nixtamalized corn ground on a metate. The women shaped each tortilla by hand, slapping it between flat palms like a quiet drum. Buffalo soldiers learned to wrap beans, jerky, and bacon grease inside, eating them folded like a working man's burrito long before the word existed in English. By 1885, the cooks at Camp Naco were making their own simple flour tortillas in the mess. They were not as good as the masa version. They worked all the same. Tortillas added a portable bread to a man's saddlebag that Hardtack never quite matched. Imagine the daily trade, a dozen for a dime, 2 cultures handing food across a fence line as if the border were not really there. It was that simple. The food crossed first, the papers came later. Number 17, saltfish on Fridays. Many Buffalo soldiers grew up Catholic in Louisiana or Maryland. Others grew up African Methodist, Episcopal, or Baptist with strong Southern Friday food traditions. The Army accommodated both with a salt cod or salt mackerel ration on Friday nights at fixed posts. The cooks soaked the fish in 3 changes of water to draw out the salt, then fried it in pork fat with onions and pepper. The plate came out simple and sharp tasting. A trooper from New Orleans, John Charles Robinson, 9th Cavalry, wrote home from Fort Robinson in 1884 that the Friday fish was the only meal that reminded him of his grandmother's stove. That single sentence, preserved in pension files, opens a window most history books leave shut. Black men in blue uniforms tasted home through the salt of a fish their kin had been frying since slavery time. The food was a threadback, the thread held even out at the far edge of the country. Friday saltfish was a small ritual of belonging. Number 18, hardtack pudding. The cooks turned stale hardtack into something almost sweet. They pounded the biscuits to fine powder, mixed in flour, water, and a spoon of bacon grease, rolled it out, layered stewed dried apples and a few raisins on top, wrapped the whole thing in a clean sack, and boiled it for an hour. The pudding came out dense, warm, and weirdly comforting, like a hug after a long ride. Drummer boy William Bircher of the 2nd Minnesota wrote down a version of this recipe during the Civil War. Buffalo soldier cooks adapted it for the frontier in the 1870s. On Christmas Day at Fort Davis in 1873, the cooks served hardtack pudding with a thin sugar glaze to the entire 9th Cavalry Detachment. A few of those men had been enslaved less than a decade earlier. They ate dessert that night because they had earned a country that was still arguing about whether to let them have one. Dessert was the rarest plate in a soldier's week. That Christmas plate was a quiet act of dignity, and the recipe still surfaces in regimental memoirs that survived from those years. Number 19, soul belly and beans. On a moonless night in May 1880, Sergeant George Jordan led 25 men on a forced night march toward Fort Tularosa, New Mexico. The Apaches had been raiding the settlement. The detachment moved 14 miles in 8 hours over rough country. They reached the fort at dawn. Jordan's cook had only one pot working when the firing started. He kept it simmering through the entire engagement. Apache warriors pressed the walls for 2 days. The cook fed the defenders in shifts from that single iron pot of salt pork and beans, never letting it go dry. Jordan held the line with 24 men against a force several times larger. When the Apaches broke off, the soldiers ate from the same pot one more time, then collapsed into sleep. 10 years later, in 1890, Jordan received the Medal of Honor for that defense and for a second action at Carrizo Canyon. The pension files record one more detail. Jordan sent a portion of his pay home each month to a woman in Tennessee who had once cooked for him as a boy. He bought her a stove. She wrote him back that the stove worked better than anything she had owned in 50 years. Sow belly and beans kept Tularosa standing. The same dish in a small Tennessee kitchen kept a memory standing too. The pot at Tularosa, the stove in Tennessee, both proof that food can be a letter sent across the decades. Back then, that was how a man wrote home. Number 20, post garden cabbage. By the late 1870s, the Quartermaster Corps required every fixed post to maintain a company garden. At Fort Robinson, Nebraska, the 9th Cavalry kept 4 full acres in cabbage, potatoes, onions, turnips, beets, and squash. Cabbage was the big winner. It grew fast, stored long, and held its vitamin content through the winter if you packed it tight in a root cellar. The cooks chopped it raw into slaw with vinegar and bacon grease, or boiled it with salt pork and pepper. A simple cabbage and bacon plate served alongside cornbread was one of the most satisfying suppers a buffalo soldier ate at a fixed post. The garden also gave the men ownership over their own food. They planted, weeded, and harvested. The food on the plate came from soil they had broken themselves. Subsistence farmers back home would have recognized the gesture. The garden was a kind of declaration written in dirt. It was that simple, and the men knew it. Number 21, onion and potato hash. A simple skillet meal that the cook served for breakfast about 3 mornings a week. Diced potato, sliced onions, chunks of leftover salt pork, all fried hard in bacon grease until the bottoms went golden and crispy. The hash hit the tin plate steaming, and the men ate it standing at the long mess hall benches before reveille was even done sounding. At Fort Apache in 1883, the kitchen produced hash for 92 men in under an hour using 2 cast iron skillets and a wood stove. The cooks worked in a kind of rhythm, one flipping, one chopping, one keeping the coffee on like a small machine. A buffalo soldier ate hash and felt the day start. It was working class food at a working class hour, and it didn't fail. Anyone who has ever cooked breakfast at a deer camp learned it from someone who learned it from someone who served. The chain runs back, one stove at a time, all the way to those frontier mornings. Number 22, prairie chicken roast. On the high plains of Wyoming and Nebraska, prairie chickens, what we now call greater prairie chickens, were everywhere in the 1870s. A trooper could shoot 2 or 3 in an afternoon. The cook plucked them, salted them, stuffed the cavity with onion and a handful of dried herbs, and roasted them whole in the coals of the campfire. The skin came out crisp and dark. The meat was darker than chicken, closer to pheasant in flavor. 3 prairie chickens fed a squad of 8. By the 1890s, the birds were thinning fast from overhunting and habitat loss. A buffalo soldier on patrol in 1879 ate prairie chicken because it was there. A buffalo soldier on patrol in 1899 had to ride twice as far to find one. The transformed plains were already telling the story of what was being lost. Years of unchecked hunting changed those grasslands forever. The pots simmered the same way, the country underneath them did not. That contrast still tells the truth about the era. Number 23, Apache mescal share. Compare the food of a buffalo soldier at Fort Apache in 1880 to the food of an Apache warrior in the same valley. The trooper ate hardtack, salt pork, beans, coffee, and whatever the company garden produced. The Apache ate roasted mescal hearts, mesquite bean cakes, dried venison, wild onions, juniper berries, and prickly pear. One came shipped in barrels. The other came up out of the ground itself. When the regiments worked alongside Apache scouts, food crossed the line both ways. The scouts taught the cooks how to roast mescal hearts in pit ovens, the slow, sweet caramel of a plant that took 12 hours to cook right. The buffalo soldiers shared coffee, sugar, and Arbuckle's beans in return. A captain at Fort Huachuca in 1886 noted in his journal that joint suppers between buffalo soldier troops and Apache scouts were the best meals at the post. White cavalry units ate worse alone off rations. The buffalo soldiers ate better because they were willing to learn. American cooking owes more to that mescal pit than any cookbook ever recorded. Number 24, vinegar and salt pickle. The Army issued vinegar in 2-ounce daily allotments. The cooks used most of it for pickling. They pickled cabbage into a rough sauerkraut. They pickled cucumbers from the garden. They pickled wild onions. They pickled hard-boiled eggs in jars when the post had laying hens. A buffalo soldier on Sunday afternoon at Fort Stockton in 1882 might pull a pickled egg from a crock, peel it on the porch of the barracks, and eat it with a slice of cornbread and a cup of coffee. That was Sunday. Pickling stretched the harvest from August into March. It also pushed back against scurvy when the desiccated vegetables ran out. The simple acid of vinegar, applied in jars, was a quiet form of medicine that the post surgeons came to depend on through the long western winters. A grandmother in Tennessee or Mississippi kept a pickle crock by the back door for the same reasons. Pantries ran on vinegar. The cavalry pantry was not different. It was older. Number 25, Sunday post-mess beef. At fixed posts, Sunday dinner was the meal of the week. The cooks pulled out the best cut of fresh beef the post butcher had, usually a chuck roast or a rump. They seasoned it with salt and pepper, seared it hard in a Dutch oven, then braised it for 4 hours over low coals with onions, carrots, potatoes, and a pour of beer if anyone had any. The pot came out at 1 o'clock to a mess hall full of men in clean uniforms. The 24th Infantry at Fort Huachuca held Sunday dinner at long tables with white tablecloths. The cooks pressed themselves on a Saturday night. A buffalo soldier ate Sunday beef, drank his coffee, and looked across at men who had crossed the same hard country he had. Sunday dinner wasn't just supper. It was the rare hour the Army fed them like men, not numbers. The plates were clean by 1:30. The dignity stayed all week. Black families would later set their own Sunday tables in cities all over the country, carrying that same instinct home. One day a week, the food said, "You matter." Once that was rare, now it is tradition. Blackstrap molasses stirred into warm milk was a morning drink, providing iron and energy for black soldiers facing demanding days of training. The molasses, dark and thick with slightly bitter edge, was spooned into heated milk and stirred until liquid turned deep brown. This drink was nutritious and economical, offering essential minerals that helped to maintain strength when fresh food was scarce. Many soldiers had grown up drinking this at home, where molasses was cheaper than sugar and provided benefits. Mothers understood instinctively. The warmth and distinctive flavor brought comfort during early mornings in unfamiliar barracks far from home. For black troops facing discrimination while serving their country, small comforts helped maintain morale. It was sustenance carrying heritage in every sip.
Navy bean soup might have been a military staple, but for black soldiers, it carried a deeper warmth. Thick and hearty, it filled the stomach and steadied the nerves after long, cold days in camp. The beans were slow cooked until soft, flavored with ham bones, onions, or whatever scraps were available. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real food, reliable, honest, and sustaining. Many soldiers compared it to the soups their mothers made, where love simmered alongside necessity. In a segregated army, where dignity was often rationed too, a bowl of soup could remind a man that he still mattered. It was nourishment and memory, comfort and pride. The smell of navy bean soup rising from the mess tent could make even the toughest day feel human again. Each spoonful carried strength from the past and hope for the next morning. It wasn't just rations, it was resilience, ladled out one bowl at a time.
Sorghum popcorn balls appeared on Christmas tables throughout black households where both ingredients grew abundantly and cost almost nothing. Popcorn was popped over wood fires, then drizzled with hot sorghum syrup, boiled to the perfect sticky stage. Buttered hands shaped the mixture into balls while still warm, pressing firmly so kernels held together. The syrup added deep, earthy sweetness that refined sugar could never match, complementing the toasted corn perfectly. Children received these as Christmas gifts, wrapped in waxed paper or tucked into small bags. Sorghum popcorn balls represented the ingenuity of families who grew their own sweetener and corn. The treats lasted for days, carried in pockets and nibbled slowly to make Christmas stretch as far as possible.
Biscuits and sawmill gravy carried the taste of Appalachian and Southern kitchens into military mess halls where black soldiers gathered each morning. The biscuits were made from flour, lard, and buttermilk when available, rolled and cut by hand before baking until golden. The gravy started with pan drippings from whatever meat had been cooked, thickened with flour, and stretched with milk into creamy sauce seasoned with black pepper. This was filling and familiar food, providing comfort during uncertain times. Black mess hall cooks understood that breakfast was more than nutrition. It was a reminder of mothers and grandmothers who served this same dish at wooden tables back home. The gravy soaked into biscuits, softening them into something warm that stayed with the man through morning drills.
Fried catfish Fridays were a ritual, not just a meal. In church halls and military bases alike, Friday night meant catfish sizzling in oil, cornmeal crackling, and laughter spilling over tin plates. It was a moment of normalcy in a world gone uncertain. The dish carried deep spiritual and cultural weight, a reminder of faith, family, and the rhythm of Southern life. Black soldiers looked forward to it the way others longed for letters from home. The crisp coating, the smell of hot oil, and the squeeze of lemon made everything else fade for a while. Even when stationed far away, memories of catfish frying in backyard skillets could make the barracks feel less lonely. The tradition linked them to a community that still prayed for them on Sundays and fried fish on Fridays, waiting for their safe return. Fried catfish wasn't just food, it was fellowship on a plate, a taste of shared heritage that gave courage to keep going. In every bite was the strength of home, the sound of gospel hymns, and the reminder that no war could steal their spirit.
Brown sugar fudge appeared at Christmas, when white sugar was too expensive, but the holiday still demanded something sweet. Brown sugar was cooked with milk, butter if available, and vanilla until it reached softball stage, then beaten until it thickened into creamy, grainy fudge. The flavor was deeper than white sugar fudge, with caramel notes making each piece taste richer than its humble ingredients suggested. Mothers poured the mixture into buttered pans, scored squares, and hid them until Christmas morning. Brown sugar cost less than refined white, making this fudge possible even in the hardest times. The candy proved that Depression-era cooks could create luxury from pantry staples and patience, turning nothing into something worth celebrating.
Hardtack soaked in coffee was a battlefield breakfast Black soldiers learned to appreciate during overseas deployment when a fresh food was impossible. The hard, dry biscuits were nearly inedible alone, but soaking them in hot coffee softened them enough to chew while adding bitterness that made them palatable. This was survival food, yet Black troops found ways to make it work by dunking hardtack until it became something approaching breakfast. The coffee was often weak, stretched to serve many men, but its warmth provided psychological comfort in cold trenches. Soldiers shared techniques for softening hardtack, passing knowledge along just as families passed down recipes at home. This breakfast represented adaptation and resilience, turning military necessity into sustenance that kept men going.
Cornbread and molasses was the poor man's feast that tasted like plenty. It was cheap to make, easy to carry, and comforting to eat, a southern pairing that stuck to the ribs and soothed the spirit. Cornmeal was rationed but still available, and molasses was sweet, thick, and nourishing, adding just enough energy to push through long days. Soldiers who grew up on this combination knew it as both breakfast and dessert, the kind of meal that could stretch through the week. It reminded them of home kitchens where cornbread baked in cast iron and molasses dripped slow from old jars. Together, they told a story of endurance, of making do with what little there was and still finding sweetness in it. Even overseas, when food came from tins and supply lines, that memory of warm bread and syrupy molasses could lift morale. Cornbread and molasses didn't look like luxury, but it felt like love served simple. It was the taste of the South, of strength and of gratitude, reminding every soldier that comfort could come from the most humble plate. Each bite was a promise that no matter how far they went, home lived in the flavor of the meal.
Parched peanut brittle was the Christmas candy requiring nothing but peanuts, sugar, and patience over a hot stove. Peanuts grown in backyard gardens were roasted until fragrant, then folded into caramelized sugar and poured thin onto greased surfaces. The mixture hardened into sheets that shattered into golden shards, delivering satisfying crunch, followed by rich, roasted flavor. Making brittle required careful attention since the sugar could burn in seconds. But experienced cooks knew exactly when to pull the pot from heat. The candy stored well in tins, making it ideal for gift giving when money was scarce. Parched peanut brittle proved that homegrown ingredients, transformed by skill, could rival any store-bought confection, bringing pride to families with nothing but determination.
Salt pork and grits became a cornerstone breakfast for Black troops stationed at domestic bases during the war years. The salt pork was sliced thin and fried slowly until the fat rendered out and edges turned crispy, filling mess halls with smoky aroma. Grits were cooked in large batches, stirred constantly, then served alongside the pork with rendered fat, drizzled over for richness. This combination provided protein and carbohydrates needed for grueling training exercises that began before dawn. Black cooks in segregated kitchens took pride in preparing this dish properly, knowing good breakfast could lift spirits and strengthen bodies. The grits absorbed the salty, smoky flavor, creating a simple but satisfying meal that connected soldiers to their southern roots while preparing for battles overseas.
Peanut butter sandwiches might have been simple, but they carried a universe of meaning. 2 slices of bread, a thick smear of peanut butter, maybe some jelly if you were lucky. They were cheap, packed with calories, and easy to send overseas without spoiling. Mothers wrapped them in wax paper, prayed over them, and hoped their sons got to taste home again. That first bite meant safety, even if just for a second. Peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth and reminded you that life still had sweetness to it. Soldiers shared them, traded them, hoarded them for hard days. They were portable comfort, a reminder of childhood and kitchens that smelled like toast and laughter. Peanut butter sandwiches didn't need to be fancy. They were a lifeline made edible. For Black soldiers, they carried something deeper too, the love of family and the quiet resilience of communities that sent everything they could, even when they had little to spare.
Today, the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum in Houston holds the largest collection of Black American military history in the world. The Cavalry Plain at West Point was renamed Buffalo Soldier Field in 1973. The 9th and 10th Cavalry served until 1944. Sergeant George Jordan rests at Fort McPherson National Cemetery, Nebraska. Every recipe on this list passed through the hands of men whose grandparents had been enslaved and whose grandchildren would walk through doors America once locked. They cooked, they ate, they fought, and they earned a country that's still telling them to wait. Their stoves are cold, their pots sit in museums, their food is on this page, so the next generation does not start from nothing.